And hello, welcome once again to our series on career counseling, coming to you today from back at our home base in New Haven. Now, in the last talk, we examined some theoretical models of decision-making and change processes, which all have in common the idea that people don't make decisions all of a sudden, at least not good ones, but that there are, in fact, identifiable stages along the way. Now, today, we're going to be looking at specific interventions that counselors might make with individuals who are seemingly stuck at one or another of these stages. That's the idea. So this is the more practical side of things, if you will. And that said, why don't we open up some slides for you and think about it. Now, again, as a counselor, career counselor or otherwise, you are often involved in guiding your clients through a decision-making process. Do I go to that school? Do I accept this job offer? Do I marry this person who's proposed marriage to me? Or, of course, many smaller decisions as well. We're also, though, involved in the process of kind of educating them about decision making. Now, sometimes this is done kind of implicitly, as the counselor models careful, reflective thinking and so forth and so on. In other cases, it's made more explicit. In particular, cognitive behavioral therapists can be very explicit about the more educational or pedagogical function that they're engaged in here. Because what we hope, if we're ethical practitioners, is that our clients aren't going to need us forever, but that when, in fact, they've completed their work with us, they will have acquired skills they can continue to use in the months and years to come. And again, in the world of career counseling, we are almost invariably engaged in short-term or even brief counseling interventions. So it's all the more important to be explicit and efficient in this process. All righty. So again, what I want to say to you now is that our interventions should be appropriate to the stage of decision-making and the style of decision-making that characterize our clients at the present time. And you see, historically, counselors and therapists in general have been very focused on making the change happen. So the idea is that you get clients who come in and they're like, yep, I got to do something. I think maybe I'm going to do that. Can you help me? And we're like, yeah, we're going to help you, help you, adjust to going to that new school, help you stay clean and serene if you're quitting drug use, whatever it happens to be. And if you had clients, which you always did, who were, I don't know if I really need to make any changes here, or whatever, they'd be considered to be in denial, which meant they're bad clients somehow, and we would expect them to fail. And when they did, we'd be like, yep, right again, as opposed to allowing what's perhaps a more accurate interpretation that we didn't approach the case correctly. Because the proper approach is to diagnose where a client is in the decision-making process, meet them there, and use appropriate interventions, appropriate responses to them that will enable them to move smoothly and perhaps expeditiously through that particular stage and into the next. So if you have a client, in Prochaska's model, who's in the contemplation stage, you would like to get them to the point where they're ready to make a decision, to commit to a course of action and moving into the preparation stage, but you can't assume that they're there yet. So we're going to begin with examples of clients who are in what is undoubtedly the most difficult phase, pre-contemplation in the Prochaska model. This would correspond with the unconflicted adherence style in Irving Janis's model. These are people who have not yet gotten the message that there's something wrong and that maybe they need to make some changes. So, now again, if you're in the CASV model, they're, at the communication stage, but they haven't gotten the message yet. So these are the most difficult clients because these are people who we can look at and say to ourselves, with great confidence, wow, there's a problem here, something needs to happen. But when they look at themselves, if they do at all, they don't really see that there's any need to do anything. And that's very frustrating for counselors. But believe me, it's also very frustrating for the client to have a counselor who's all about like, yeah, you got to do this. You gotta get your resume in order and start looking for a new job. Or yeah, you really got to stop, drinking so much or at all. And, it's just like, you're not hearing me. That's not what I'm talking about. So fortunately, we do have a few tested and true types of interventions that have at least some impact in this situation. And I'm going to touch on two that have been around for quite a while and are known to have at least a modest impact, and then one somewhat more recently developed that has become extremely popular. And so the first one is something known as the awareness of rationalizations procedure. This was developed, I think, way back in the 1970s. And originally, the early studies of this were done with people who were smokers and cigarette, tobacco smokers. And the idea was, can we get them to break out of this, unconflicted adherence, as they called it then, into being aware that there actually is a problem and maybe someday they ought to do something about it. So this is a very straightforward intervention. It is demonstrably effective up to a point. The major drawback is that you really have to do your homework on this. You have to do a lot of preparation for the individual scenario. So you really would only use it if you're frequently encountering clients in roughly the same situation. And again, in career counseling, that might mean people who need outplacement work, help, for example. That you know that the likelihood is that their company or agency is going to either close or markedly downsize, and yet not all of the employees have yet accepted that reality. So this is why you need to prepare for it. What you need to do is to first identify the sorts of rationalizations that people are likely to use to justify the behavior. So back in the day, how do they still justify smoking tobacco, as being not threatening to them, right? So, they say, oh, well, it's not really been proven that it causes cancer or proven that it causes heart disease. And, it actually can be good for you in this way and that way and some other way. And of course, these rationalizations in that case were for a long time promulgated and encouraged by the tobacco industry and bogus research that they financed. So you have to identify these. What do people say to justify continuing in their present course? And then you collect, the appropriate information that rebuts each one of these rationalizations. Remember, rationalization is in some ways, of course, it's a psychoanalytic term, but in some ways, it's another way of saying cognitive dissonance, right? If I'm doing something that I know to be wrong, I can change what I'm doing, or I can convince myself that it isn't wrong. But it's unpleasant to be doing it while knowing that it's the wrong course of action. You're trying to get them to stop using the emotion-focused coping of the rationalization defense and start to feel the discomfort, so they will be motivated to actually take effective steps, problem-focused steps, to deal with the situation. And then, you know the rationalizations, you have the specific bullet points that rebut each one, and you could make little flashcards. I mean, you could use traditional index cards for this, or you could do something fancy on your computer. I really don't care. But the idea is that you have the rationalization on one side and the information that rebuts it on the other side. We don't know the factory is going to close, and then you have various data points about all the times where these warning signs have been out there, and in fact, the factories have closed every time. It won't be hard to get a new job, and you have on the flip side the data about how difficult it can be in a factory town environment when several of the big mills have closed down, and everybody is scrambling at once for whatever is in effect no new jobs. I'll make out something new, and then again, information about how you actually need to be trained for those new things if they're going to pay much above minimum wage. So you have your little stack of cards, And then you sit down with your client and you hand them a card partway through the session. You explain a little about what you're going to do. Say, could you read that out loud, the rationalization? And you want them to say it out loud, like they're actually saying it, because that gives a little more of a sense of commitment to it. And then you can ask, so have you ever said this to justify your smoking? Or have you ever said this to justify not doing anything to retrain yourself or prepare for a new occupation? And if they say yes, you proceed to the next step. If they say no, you say, have you heard other people say this to justify, taking no action to prepare for the possibility of the plant closing? And again, if they say no, you proceed to the next question. Do you feel deep down it might be a reasonable position to take? As soon as you get a yes, you say, okay, now could you turn that around? And I want you to read each of the points that are there. And again, you want them to read it out loud so they've read it. Also, they then have said it. They have embodied the message. And you get the idea. They have now specifically said why that is not an accurate way of understanding the situation or a good way of handling it. And having done that, having embodied it and said it, has an impact on their attitude. Again, it's measurable, it's modest in magnitude, but it's there. And it all happened in the course of 15 minutes, 20 minutes, like half a session. That's it. Of course, you go through each of the cards in turn, and all the ones where you get any kind of a yes, you make sure they look at all the rebuttals. So that's a good one. Sounds a little dry and a lot of prep for it, but again, simple. And once you've prepared it, quite simple and effective. A second approach is known as emotional role playing. And again, this is another one that goes back 50 years or at this point. And this one is based more on the sort of experiential or psychodrama and Gestalt therapy sorts of approaches. Again, it has some research to back it up. It's very different in that whereas the awareness of rationalizations can feel to some counselors a little bit dry and mechanical, this one calls for you to be really at the top of your game, be very interpersonally agile, let's say. So again, you have to do your homework. That's another drawback here too. But what you do is to kind of prepare little scenarios as if you're going to do some ad lib theater work, right? And so you have 3 or 4 scenes that are relevant to their situation. This one was first studied again in the context of smoking cessation, and the scenes involved being at the doctor's office with a persistent cough, and one hoping that you're not seriously ill, like developing lung cancer, having the doctor tell you, that she's running some tests, some therapist, counselor person actually comes out acting the part of the doctor, maybe wearing a little white lab coat and stethoscope if you want to ham it up a bit, and, tells them, some of the facts about, we're a little concerned because of the connections between cancer, blah, blah, blah. We're going to have some tests run. We'll get right back to you. Wait here and, we'll let you know. Then you're left in the waiting room. Well, have a soliloquy. So the client is supposed to speak out loud what their thoughts are as they're waiting for the tests to come back. Doctor comes back. And again, this is a scripted thing for the counselor, tells them, the tests are positive. It's a fairly advanced lung cancer, that the prognosis is not favorable, but there's a chance they'll be able to put it into remission. Don't count on it, but meanwhile, wait right here. I'm going to line up a hospital admission for you right away so we can decide whether to do surgery or blah, 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 and then leaves, and the person is left with the soliloquy, as they're waiting for the ambulance. Now, again, you could imagine this around, the situation of, that there's a strong likelihood or even a certainty that a certain, agency or company or government department is going to be grossly downsized or shut down, and you're trying to get past the denial of some of the employees that they are actually going to have to take serious steps to deal with this. So, again, it's sort of a mixture of scenes where you as the counselor have your scripted part and you get to use your acting chops, and scenes where the client is left alone. Now you're in the room, but you kind of go off behind them, I suppose. And, they're supposed to just be saying their thoughts out loud. And I suppose at times you could throw in a little whispered, don't forget about, that sort of thing, to be the haunting voice of conscience. So this again is known to have, on average, some effect. It's more variable than the awareness of rationalizations procedure. Sometimes you get a pronounced positive impact from this because it's powerful, and sometimes you actually get a negative impact in the sense of the client just feeling overwhelmed and distressed by it because it's powerful. And if you've ever read up on this, the experiential role-playing interventions have demonstrably carry with them some demonstrable risk of harm. They are potentially very useful, very powerful therapeutic interventions, but because they're powerful, they can backfire. So you really want to know your client. Is this somebody who, can tolerate the intense affect that can be stirred up here? So, there's two great ones that have been around a long time. And I said there's a third, somewhat more recently developed, 1990s as opposed to 70s, very popular these days. It's a set of techniques known as motivational interviewing, introduced by William R. Miller, who was himself working in the addictions field. Now, this is not a place where we have room to really delve into motivational interviewing. That deserves weeks and weeks, if not more, training all of its own. But I'll touch on a few of the salient points for those who may not have encountered it before. Essentially, motivational interviewing is person-centered therapy or Rogerian therapy with a twist. Miller had a strong Rogerian background. And again, without going into the history of the development of MI, he observed that addiction counselors who used a subtly modified form of Rogerian methodology were markedly more successful than those who used a more direct confrontational sort of method. So the key here is that one of the necessary ingredients for change in Rogerian language is that there needs to be some discrepancy between one's self-concept or self-image as one is and one's self-ideal. Like, I'm not the person I should be. That creates these unpleasant feelings of discrepancy, discordant feelings inside, and that's what motivates me to engage in treatment and change. As even earlier Freud had put it, it is the suffering of the client or patient that provides the motivation to persist with the treatment. So if you don't have that, you're not going to do it. Now, traditionally, many therapists would have said, well, if they don't have the discrepancy, then, they're in denial, they're not ready. The idea here is to figure out how to actually cultivate or develop a sense of discrepancy. Yeah, you're actually making them feel worse as step one in getting them to ultimately be better. By the way, in some ways, that goes all the way back to Socrates. I'll throw that out there. So what are the methods? In the first place, you are using Rogerian interventions, person-centered interventions, restating what they say, reflecting back the thoughts and feelings, especially feelings that they're sharing with you, and always maintaining an attitude of positive regard, not being critical, not being hostile, etc. This gives them a feeling of comfort, and it, in a sense, gives them permission to begin to share the parts of themselves that do in fact feel threatened, which they're not comfortable with themselves, but it starts to leak out pretty quickly. And then you restate and reflect that at them. Don't miss those opportunities. It's like, good old Skinner, catch them being good and reinforce it. Well, in this case, catch them expressing their self-doubt, catch them expressing their concerns, and reinforce that by reflecting it back and restating it back to them. When, it's not if, when they get their back up a little, like, well, it's not that bad, no, I think things will work out. You don't push, you roll with it. You let them be. You might be thinking to yourself, nuts, they're back in denial. Preferably, you're not even thinking that. This is a natural process. They're now expressing the side of them that doesn't feel at all comfortable with change or with anything, the idea that anything is wrong, and you're going to accept that. Because if you take the other side, then you represent, you got to change, and they, with gladness and singleness of heart, can be the part that pushes back against that. You don't want to give them that luxury. Don't let them externalize their pain and project it onto you. And in addition, remember your clients, again, I'm going back to a lot of early authorities here, but if you go all the way back to Alfred Adler, practically the beginning, clients are discouraged in many cases. They don't have high expectations of success, and part of your job is to change those expectancies. So whenever they say stuff that indicates that they might be ready to make some kind of a change, you always reinforce that. So yeah, right now you're feeling like you can do this, etc. Now, again, this is a large subject. It's very easy to memorize the key points in motivational interviewing and answer multiple choice questions on a quiz. It's much harder to implement them in practice, though it helps if you're starting out with a solid foundation in Rogerian methods. Okay. By the way, many folks doing updated forms of client or person-centered or experiential therapies make extensive use of metaphors. And those, metaphors are great because they're concrete, but they also have this clear reference to what's going on for the client. What you need to be careful about, of course, is to make sure that your metaphors actually contain important information about their situation, unlike the career counselor here. Okay. Now, what if they get stuck in the next stage here, where they're supposed to be generating alternatives, coming up with different options, different ideas? And this happens a lot. They get trapped in dichotomous thinking, is how the cognitive therapists like to put it, right? Aaron Beck and the like. They're stuck. They're like, they only have one thing they can do, or they have this or that. It's like one thing or the other thing. Either I stay with this job or I quit. Either I go to this grad program or I don't, whatever. And in life, it is rare that there are only two possible options out there. So what you want is to get your client unstuck. And brainstorming is a technique often used for this purpose, not only by counselors, it's very widely used in organizational settings. And the underlying idea is, we're just going to try to come up with ideas, and we're not going to even think about whether they're any good or not. We're just going to come up with ideas. So because see, what gets in the way of people generating ideas above all else is that as soon as they think of something, before they even finish the thought, let alone verbalize it, they're judging it. They're going, oh, no, that's not going to work because, or that would be a problem because. And what you want here is just to get the ideas out on the table, so to speak. And the rules, you can make lists of rules, you can share them with your clients. By the way, you could do this in a group setting if you like, and have all the people bouncing ideas off one another, or you can do it with an individual. You could send them off as homework to do this. There's a number of different ways of approaching it. Rule number one, of course, is no evaluation. We are not going to make judgments or evaluate these ideas yet. We're not up to weighing alternatives yet. Secondly, the other core principle is more is better, right? Come up with as many ideas, as many options as you possibly can. Just keep spitting them out there. Try to be original. And, you even look for some that, in the old days, they would have called far out ideas, ideas that might seem wholly impractical or, wildly out there, but, hey, what the heck? I just finished reading a book called Operation Mincemeat, based on a true story from World War II. The older book when I was a kid was The Man Who Never Was, but there's new information, and it was in British intelligence in World War II trying to figure out how to convince the Germans that the Americans and British were not going to invade Sicily as the next step, but to convince them we were going to go somewhere else when Sicily was the obvious place. So the idea they actually acted on was to dress up a corpse in an Army office or Navy officer's uniform, create a whole identity for the person, so everything about them made sense, have them carrying secret letters to high-ranking officers in North Africa. And basically, it had to be a corpse that was young and healthy-ish, but dead, and could be construed as having drowned. And they basically dropped it in the ocean where the currents would bring it in to a part of Spain where they knew they were German agents. That's far out. In that case, it worked. So sometimes the far out idea actually will be the one you use. When you come up with alternatives that you can't help but say to yourself, yeah, but there's a problem with that, fine. Keep it on the list, but also make modifications to it, tweak it. And each time you make a little modification, it's a new idea. You can also mix and match. If I take this idea and that idea and put them together, what do I get? Asking other people, because other people have other ideas. And again, in a group setting, you've got them right there. That's the gist of it. Oh, and if they're going to be doing this for a week on their own, if they go into meditation and contemplate a bit, if they allow the idea just to incubate in the back of their mind, maybe even in their dreams, they'll start to get indications of, probably some very far out ideas, but pieces of those far out ideas often prove to be useful. That's the idea. And of course, above all, well, not above all, but finally, obviously, watch out for black and white thinking, for dichotomous thinking. Okay, brainstorming. Now, this is going to be one of the biggies. This is going to be our extended piece for today. What if they're at the stage of weighing alternatives, or in the Caspi model, valuing, and they're feeling kind of stuck because they've got a lot of information about several options, and it's just overwhelming because we have these tiny human brains that can only hold like 5, 6, 7 pieces of information at a time, in consciousness anyway. This is a very, very useful procedure in counseling, especially in career counseling, but also in other contexts, called the balance sheet procedure. And it's a balance sheet, but it's not a balance sheet with dollars and cents and necessarily with blue ink and red ink. It's a balance sheet that's in words for the most part, not numbers. But the idea is nonetheless the same. You're going to put the pros and cons down in writing. So the way the sheet will be laid out, you've got your positive outcomes on one side, usually the left, and the negative outcomes listed on the right. And you prepare a balance sheet for each of the alternatives you're considering. So let's say I'm considering, I can take a job that's local, but it's not bad, but it doesn't look amazing. Recent college graduate, let's say, I could take a job in a somewhat distant city that looks pretty cool and promising, but it's far away. I can take a job in a somewhat closer city that doesn't pay very well at all, but has real prospects for the future, or I can go to graduate school. So I have like 4 options, and they're all going to have pros and cons. So each one of those would get its own little balance sheet. And again, this is in words, it's qualitative, it's not numbers per se. If you wish, you can do this with your client. You can have them weight how important factors are, like a system of 1, 2, or 3 pluses for the pros, 1, 2, or 3 minuses for the cons, but you don't need to do that. That's optional. Now, please note, cognitive behavioral therapy, and this is a classic CBT kind of intervention, runs the risk of becoming too cerebral and too dry. But it doesn't have to be, and it really shouldn't be. This procedure should stir up some of the stuff that's emotional, not only the things that relate to dollars and cents and so forth. And as those things are stirred, you as a counselor should close right in on it. Career counseling, as I'm always saying, is counseling. This is roughly what it would look like. Of course, it would be, portrait-wise, there'd be a lot more space under each one. If you want, you can do it with lines, dividing sections up, a lot of variety of possibilities. But you'll notice that you have basically 4 sections, each of which needs more space than is present here. You're making a decision, what will I do next year about my career? And you're considering a particular option, take the hometown job. Okay. This does a lot for you. In the first place, it gets you doing a more thorough job of looking for information. You've got to find things or know things to put in each little section. And along the way, when they have any emotional reactions, pay attention to those, zero in on them and help them in the process of self-examination, right? That's important. Secondly, it makes the overall appraisal more positive, or more comprehensive, rather. Sorry, so that people, will actually have all the information they need right in front of them. And no guarantees. If I have all the information right there, I still may make a poor decision, but I'm more likely to make a good one if I have the information in front of me than if I don't. Remember, a lot of your clients are going to get stuck in defensive avoidance, where they don't want to move from here to the next stage of actually starting to make a commitment. But here, we want them getting everything out front, in front of them, and that includes the painful stuff. So we're working against the defensive avoidance by bringing out its sources. Okay. Thirdly, this kind of gets ahead to the final intervention we'll be thinking of today. It also gets you ready for possible negatives after you make a decision, because you listed possible negatives. It means you had to think about them. And the fact is, and we'll circle back to this, even when you make a good decision, not every result of that decision is going to be positive. So, you might find that it's harder to do it than you expected, or that other people are being critical of you for making the choice you made. Thinking about it in advance is a good thing. You won't be surprised, and you have a chance to prepare to deal with it. So this is actually like a script. Here's how one could introduce it. You have the little papers with you, right? So one useful way for people to consider a decision they're making, like choosing a major or what kind of job to look for, is to write down the advantages and disadvantages that could result from each possible choice. And often just going through that process, writing down the pros and cons, helps people think of important consequences they hadn't considered before. It's kind of a balance sheet. And when the balance sheet's complete, it lays down all the important factors in one place, so you can just look at it, take it in at a glance. So I'd like you to spend a little while today writing down whatever you think you might stand to gain or lose if you decide to pursue each of your top choices. General introduction. So what you do is this. At the top of a balance sheet form, I hand you one, write down one of your options. Pause. I won't always pause at the pauses. Next, now in the upper left-hand part of the page, write down all the tangible gains and other benefits you would probably get if you took that option. Be frank and candid. Write down anything you personally consider to be relevant. You don't have to tell me what you're writing. We'll discuss it afterwards. And you give them a minute or so to write a few things down. In a career context, I'm sorry. Now, in the upper right-hand corner of the page, write down all the tangible losses you might suffer from taking that option. Again, be candid. Think of any difficulties, inconveniences, or expenses that might arise and write them down. And again, allow them a minute or so. Now, as I was trying to say before, in a career counseling context, we could say that there are some fairly likely things to pop up in this context. If they're looking stuck, you could suggest some of these, what do you suppose the income is like? How hard will the work be? How interested will you be in it? Now, again, only if they haven't already said something about these things. Chances of advancement, autonomy, job security, time available for your personal interests and family, and again, its effect on your life outside of work, and also who are you going to be working with, who are you going to be in contact with all this time. Next part. Well, next, I'd like you to think about what other people might be affected materially by your decision. Your partner, children, or other people with whom you're close. Of course, if you know who those are, say so. In the next section down on the left side, write down whatever tangible gains and other benefits they might derive from your choosing this course of action. Ta-da. And as you probably have guessed, the right-hand section there is going to be tangible losses that other people might suffer. What if my job would require me to be working irregular hours, often into the night, and so my kids wouldn't see me much. That belongs there, right? Okay. You will run into a situation, of course, with unattached, childless adults who are only responsible for themselves, who are saying, that nobody else matters. It doesn't hurt to say, well, is that always going to be the case, or do you want to think about the future? But if you want to just accept it, if you're dealing with a 21-year-old who's not in a long-term relationship, doesn't have any kids, it's like, okay, if you want to skip this section, you can. So yeah, what kind of stuff? Well, income and status, and the time available for the family, the living environment they're going to be in, presuming that you have to live in certain kinds of settings, whether it's going to be helping out an organization or group you belong to, like if you belong to a particular religious group, and then other things like fringe benefits and all come into play. Next part. Well, next, I'd like you to consider how you personally would feel about following this course of action. In what ways would doing this make you feel better about yourself? Involve doing good things, help you meet long-term personal goals, whatever. Write these down in the next section on the left-hand side. And again, be frank and open. And again, you have to allow a minute or so. Offer prompts as needed. And now, in the right-hand section, write down the ways in which it might make you disapprove of yourself, any intrinsic limitations of the work, any ethical or moral compromises you'd have to make, whatever, but again, be as complete and honest as possible. What kinds of stuff can come up? Well, the extent to which your self-esteem is boosted because you're doing good things for humanity, the extent to which your work is ethically justifiable. Was in a television program I quite like, one of the characters said that what she'd done for a living was selling fake drugs to senior citizens. That could actually give you some moral qualms if you have a conscience. To what extent does the work involve compromising yourself? How creative or original is it? Does the whole way of life around the work meet your ethical standards? Does it help you to meet your long-term goals? Those sorts of things. By the way, when you get down to the bottom half here in the next section, this is the stuff a lot of people don't spontaneously talk about, but this is the stuff that often makes or breaks a choice. People immediately gravitate to pay, job security, opportunity for promotion, benefits. They don't automatically start going into this, but this is where you as a counselor want them to go. Not that you want them to not go in the direction of, can I earn a living at it or get promoted ever, but you definitely want them to come here. To what extent is this more than a job? Is this something I'm really eagerly engaged in as a part of my being? Last section. Finally, I'd like you to consider how other people may react if you do this. Think of your parents, siblings, partner, children, friends, or groups of people with whom you identify. In the bottom left-hand section, write down who you think might approve of you, respect you, or even admire you for making this choice. Again, you allow time, and then consider how those people might disapprove of your actions, and have them write those negative consequences down. Don't let them skip this section. I don't care if they're 21 and they say, oh, nobody matters to me. That's baloney. Their parents' opinion does matter to them to some extent. They have some kind of peer groups with which they identify, whether it's the kids from their high school or the neighborhood they grew up in, or it's the people in their union, or the people in their congregation, or just the people they like to party with. There's somebody that matters. There are groups of people, individuals and groups of people who matter in their life. And don't readily give in to someone saying, nobody matters to me, it's all about myself, unless you really believe that, because it tends to have a defensive aspect to it. So now you've got all that. Of course, what sorts of things, people, might admire you, respect you. They also might criticize you or even exclude you from the group that they're in, right? What if you go to work for, I don't know, let's say that a lot of your friends are, kind of leftist sorts politically, who are, urban, very, very strongly liberal, and you're going to work in the capacity where you're working for, I don't know, like a mortgage company, and everybody running it is pretty conservative, and you're going to be involved in like helping to foreclose on people's houses or something. If you take that line up, you may well find that some of your friends aren't going to want to be your friends anymore. That might or might not matter a whole lot to you, but you should take it into consideration. Will I be considered a traitor to my people in some way? That sort of thing could be negative. Or will, on the positive side, will this be something that they all go like, wow, I can't believe you're doing that. That's so cool. Okay. So before you engage in the balance sheet procedure, you should have already done some work with your client around the decision in question. They should have done some self-exploration. If in career counseling, they've probably, among other things, completed an interest or values inventory of some sort, as well as their interviews with you. They should have come up with a list of possible occupations, pathways, or if it's a simple decision about a certain job or graduate school thing, at least explored those options as much as they can, gotten information about each one. You're at that stage now where they've surveyed the alternatives and they need to move into the valuing in Casby model, in the Peterson model. You want to reinforce that they've done all this, keep pointing out to them. So far, here's what you've done to do. And if there's any truth to this, that they seem to be making progress towards an effective, healthy decision. If they haven't made much progress, don't pretend they have. Discuss what might be getting in the way. Try to be supportive. Try not to be like, well, you're really not doing anything in this process. But so you have. It could be framed as, so what you haven't found the time to do yet is to really look into the nature of what goes on in each of these occupations. We did one together, but you haven't yet found the time to look into the other ones. And that's going to limit how far we can go so far. But you still can do this. And I'd like to encourage you to. Maybe if you want, you could explore some of what got in the way, by the way. That's not a bad idea. So you introduce the balance sheet procedure sort of conceptually, and then an example, and you actually will typically work your way through one complete balance sheet for one option. There may be a need for a fair amount of prompting and questioning from you to get them to really fill it out. That's fine. It gives you something to do. And at the end of that session, you've got a pretty complete breakdown of one of their 3, 4, 5, however many options. Their homework before your next session, which in career counseling may well be the final session, is to prepare balance sheets for the other options on their short list. Now, again, this is where if they've already collected the information they need, at least some aspects of it are going to be very straightforward. And when they come back for the next session with you, you'll go over the sheets they've completed and help them to flesh them out, because I guarantee you they will not be as complete as the one that you did together. Well, I can't utterly guarantee. Yeah, okay, no, I'll guarantee it. I was thinking, what if you have kind of obsessional clients who do everything in detail, but they tend to avoid the emotional stuff. So you can have every possible tangible thing, but you're not going to have a lot of the emotional stuff there. So you typically, where you have gaps is in that bottom half of the balance sheet, where again, you as a counselor have to draw that out. So ultimately, let's say they had 4 options they're considering. They have 4 balance sheets, each quite complete with detailed information on each that they can look at, and in that next session, really move towards making a decision. Is one of these a clear winner? And is it good enough? Are they comfortable with it? And if not, is there something wrong with it that we missed so far? Or does it just need a little bit of tweaking somewhere? That's where you're going to be going. So they'll be ready to go off for the job interview, right? Now, in our last minutes, we're going to consider clients who we're finishing with, and they're getting ready to go out there into the world and deal. So what they're going to need to do is to move, they've taken action or they're taking action and they need to go into the maintenance stage in the Prochaska model or in the old Janus model, adhering despite negative feedback. The classic intervention here, which does date back to the 1960s and 70s, Janus did some early work on it. Donald Meichenbaum was the great guru of this type of approach, is known as stress inoculation training. It's a kind of a psychological answer to inoculation in medicine. So inoculation, I know at this moment as I'm recording, there's all sorts of controversy about vaccines and inoculation, but it's actually in some ways a very ancient medical procedure. There's something known as variolation, which was practiced in ancient China, India, and East Africa for prevention of smallpox. And vaccination is really just a direct descendant of the old variolation. The idea is when bad stuff happens in medicine, you get invaded by horrifying bacteria or whatnot, your immune system is in charge of fighting back. But your immune system is first caught by surprise and doesn't know what to do and has to learn how to fight these little nasty critters. So why not prepare the immune system in advance by introducing weakened forms, either literally dead, killed pathogens or ones that have been weakened in some way, so the immune system will learn how to recognize and fight them. Stress inoculation is the same concept applied to psychological stressors. If you will, in Ted Bion's theoretical model, your personality is sort of like the psychological equivalent of the immune system. It's in charge of identifying what should be here and what shouldn't be here, and figuring out how to cope with everything. So you don't get sick because a germ got in you. You get sick because a germ got in you and your immune system failed to counteract it. You don't get psychologically sick because of stress in your life, but you do if the stress in your life finds a weak point, a chink in your personality, and you're unable to cope adequately. Now, stress inoculation training is again a large subject, not one that we can cover in depth in 5 or 10 minutes here, which is all we have left. But it is one I can introduce. It's a tremendously useful set of basically CBT techniques that can be done on an individual basis or in a group setting. And it really lends itself beautifully to running psychoeducational groups where you might have the old flip chart up and you're writing down stuff that the clients say, or a shared screen on the Zoom call and you're typing stuff into writing it into the whiteboard. So there's really 3 steps involved in a basic form of stress inoculation training. So the idea is we're getting ready to go into a situation in which there might be things that go wrong. The earliest studies of this had to do with people who were preparing for elective surgery. So you're all hopeful that, they do the work on your knee or whatever, and wow, everything's going to be great. And often it might be, but you also can have adverse consequences along the way. It's been quite extensively used in settings like people getting ready to go into challenging work settings. So for example, nursing students preparing for their first practical placement, or other pre-professional people getting ready to go into their first clinical placements, internships, and so forth. But it can be used in multiple contexts. So yeah, they're thinking of going into an occupation or a graduate program. There's lots of good stuff they're anticipating. There also should be bad stuff they anticipate. It may or may not happen, but if you don't anticipate it and it happens, you're shocked and dismayed. If you had anticipated it and prepared for it, you're like, oh, all right, here it is. I guess I can deal. So you want to make sure that that they have access to and they have processed realistic information about the stuff that could go wrong. This is something that's called the work of worrying. Now, if you have a client who's a real worrywart and they've already gone, okay, you can omit this section if they've made it very clear that they've thought about this, and this, 4 or 5 things that could go wrong. Then they've done that piece of work. The other side of step 1, though, along with either telling them or helping them to see or ascertaining that they already see the negatives, is to call attention to the things that should help them, the positive features, personal strengths and protective factors, things that are going to make it more likely that they'll succeed. You're going off on internship, it's going to be tough, but fundamentally your supervisor's in your corner. And fundamentally, the professor at your graduate school who's overseeing your work from a distance is very much in your corner. And there will be other interns going through similar stuff, et cetera, et cetera. Step two is where you really start to get into the nitty gritty of what we're going to do about it. First off, find out what they already do to cope with stress that might be relevant to the situation. So review it, like, so what do you do? And any appropriate coping skills that they use, you want to, be nodding and like, that sounds really great. So if thus and such happens, you could do that, right? And you remind them, like, so remember that, this may or may not happen, but if it does, this is one of your plans, is to do that. And that really, really likely would help. By the way, I did say appropriate coping skills, so sure, meditation and your herbal tea and going for a long run in the evening, these are all great. Knocking off a fifth of scotch, probably not one to reinforce as much. I mean, if they're going to have a drink with the co-workers after work, great. Just be careful how much they're talking about. And secondly, in this stage, you can teach them new skills. So here's again, psychoeducation at work. And, you can have various, things to do with like mindfulness exercises, breathing exercises, whatever they happen to be, that you can teach them, or in some cases, the two of you may work together. So, you can let them know, for example, that having realistic, positive messages for yourself is a good thing. So, let's come up with some realistic, positive messages. And what they have to remember then is when they're feeling this particular kind of stress, that they remind themselves of these positive things. And then thirdly, the third step involves practice. Again, individual or group, they can do some of this just in imagination. So I'd like you to imagine now that your supervisor has just told you to do an evaluation of a patient. And you come onto the ward and approach the patient, and the patient has looked at you and belched foul breath at you and said, I don't want to see no intern. Get out of my face. I'm not going to talk to you. And now you have to go back to your supervisor and say, well, I failed. I couldn't get through to them, whatever it happens to be. So imagine it. You can walk through the scenarios that they've begun to develop and have them practice what they would do about it. You also can have them do this in session with you, or again, if it's a group, that's lovely. You can have 2 or 3 people enacting a little scenario, remembering to do it, and the others are learning from observing what's happening. And of course, last but not least, you can have them go off and do these things as homework. That's stress inoculation training in a nutshell, literally a nutshell. So to sum up, remember, decision-making is one of the most central things that we do with these big brains of ours. It's something that we can do on a much higher level than virtually any other creature living on this planet. But although we can do it very effectively, many of us are not great at it. We can learn how to do better. And as counselors, we can facilitate that process. And, especially if you're comfortable operating in a CBT model, these are your happy hunting grounds. You're going to love doing this sort of work. And within this realm of decision-making, we know about very specific interventions or counseling procedures that can be used depending on where they are in the process. All of that being said, we're going to get ready to say farewell for the day and see you next time.